Hi, this is Charlie Brown. I'm the interim pastor at Cool Spring Baptist Church, and every Wednesday night at 6:30 we meet in a small group for Bible study. And before our Bible study begins, we've been having conversations about principles of biblical interpretation. How do we understand Scripture? How do we approach the Scripture? How do we practice good disciplines to manage Scripture appropriately? And tonight I want to speak about one very specific aspect of interpreting Scripture. It's dealing with a genre of Scripture called Apocalyptic literature. It's the literature that is used in the book of Revelation, which tends to be very, very interesting for people or very, very intimidating. The word apocalypse or apocalyptic means to reveal, to disclose, to open up, to help people understand or to see more clearly, which sounds like a contradiction in terms because Revelation doesn't seem to be very clear when you're trying to read and understand it. There are a number of approaches to interpreting the book of Revelation. So I'm going to give you some scholastic terms tonight. First one is called the Preterist approach to interpreting the book of Revelation. This is the approach in which you say, you look at Revelation as a first century document that has some predictive elements into the future. The second one is called continuous historical. This one basically says that what was written in the first century had a specific truth for the people of that day, and then you take those truths and you bring them forward into the 21st century. But it doesn't have that predictive element. It's not like the book of Revelation is telling you all these things that are going to happen into the future. The third one is called an Amillennial approach. Amillennial school sees the book of Revelation as forecasting history in 7 cycles, and each cycle is a millennium or 1,000 years long. Postmillennial approach is an approach that believes that the church is going to usher in the millennial reign of Christ on earth through missions and ministry. Historical premillennial approach expects a literal millennium on earth after Jesus returns. So he returns, there's the rapture, and then you have a 1,000-year reign of Christ. And then there's one called the dispensational premillennial. Aren't you excited you tuned into this thing? It's very popular. It was made very popular, at least by Hal Lindsey and some of his books on the end times, the book series Left Behind, etc. This is the idea that there's the rapture of the church followed by 7 years of great tribulation followed by a 1,000-year reign of Christ. So there are 6 different approaches to the book of Revelation, and then there's all kinds of what does this mean in the context of Revelation. It gets even crazier. So another question that I think most people ask is, how in the world do I understand all of these symbols in the book of Revelation? What do they mean, and how do I get a hand on that? My personal approach, and you don't have to have this approach. This is not where we pick and choose and start fights. I'm going to tell you there are biblical scholars that take a lot of different views. Very good scholars, very serious believers, and they all disagree, or many of them disagree on which of these approaches is the most accurate and the best approach to take to Scripture. There's just a lot of opinion out there, and so I'm not telling you that mine is the one and everybody else is trash. I'm just telling you this is the approach that I use. And I do believe in the continuous historical approach. I believe that the symbols in the book of Revelation came out of Old Testament history and were familiar with the people in the first century, the people that John was actually writing to. And so when he used some type of a symbol or figurative speech, the people of his day understood perfectly what he was talking about. They connected the dots. And while it sounded really strange, while it does sound strange to us, for them, it clicked immediately. If I say to you, if you're an American, and I use the phrase 9/11, virtually every American immediately goes to, that was the day when the terrorist attacks tore down the World Trade Center, planes were crashing, and other places across the United States. It was a horrific, terrible day. And that's the image that we have. We probably literally have visual images of seeing those planes crashing into the World Trade Center. And so we simply call it 9/11. If you were isolated on some island and had never had television or internet or anything, and you had no knowledge that there was a terrorist attack on the United States, and someone said 9/11 to that person, they would go, I have no clue what you're talking about unless that's the number you call for an emergency. They wouldn't connect the dots. They didn't understand. There's no context for them. But there was context for first century believers. So our task is to understand what the first century believers were understanding and what was the message that John was giving to those first century believers at that time. Once we understand the truth and what he was saying to them, we simply take that truth and we move it forward to where we are today and say the truth is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And so that's the truth that we're looking for. And from my perspective, I'm not looking for some predictive war that's going to happen, or some dictator, or some specific person that's going to pop up in history and take that like a puzzle piece and plug it into the book of Revelation. That's contrary to the way I approach Scripture. I approach the book of Revelation the same way I approach every other book in the Bible. Who wrote it? When did they write it? What was the context in which they were writing? Who were they writing to? What was the main theme, or what was the main truth that the author was communicating to the people of that day and that time? That's the truth we're looking for. And so that's why I go with what's called this continuous historical model. Now, when we get into the book of Revelation, we do see all kinds of figurative speech and symbolism and stuff, and that can be very confusing. One of the terms, we may not see this in Scripture, but we're familiar with it. We hear about it all the time. It's in the end times, or end times theology, or end times prophecy. When people hear that phrase, end times, they're thinking, oh, we're very close to when Jesus is coming again. And that may be the truth. But the end times technically exist from the crucifixion, resurrection event until Jesus comes again. And so all of that is end times. It's not just the last 10 years before Jesus comes again. We have been in the end times for like 2,000 years. And so what's happening in the book of Revelation has been happening in the context of our world really for 2,000 years. There are numerous numbers that are used in the book of Revelation, and those numbers have meanings. They had meanings to the Jews because the Jews attached all different kinds of symbolic meanings to the numbers that they used. For example, the number 1 stood for independence. If there's just one of you, you can stand strong, you can be independent. Number 2 had the meaning of strength. If a person had to travel from one town to another, they would have to travel along roads that could be very dangerous. And so they would take someone along with them, and by going 2 by 2, there was more strength in numbers to double their, quote, population on the road. But just to have somebody else go along with them gave them additional strength. The number 3, in my recollection, had to do with family. Mother, father, child. Number 4 was eternity. 4 directions, as far as east is from west, as far as north is from south, north and south, east and west. That's the concept of eternity, something so far away without any time or limits whatsoever. The number 5 was a semi-completion because the number 10 was total completion, and 5 would only be half of that. For reasons I can't explain, but I've done this, when a child is born, the father immediately goes and counts fingers and toes. And if they have 10, in their mind, the mind of the father, the child is complete. The number 10 meant completion. The number 6 was the evil number. It was the worst number. It was evil because it was so close to 7, which was the holiest number, but it fell 1 short. Even though it's only 1 short, it was still a total miss. And so you get the number 6. And of course, from the number 6, we kind of stretch that out to 666, the number of the beast or the Antichrist. That's the maximum evil number that we can possibly imagine. Number 7 was a holy number. And again, in my recollection, I think it's the idea of a family and how critical and important that was, combined with eternity. And all of a sudden, you have a holy number. Number 8 meant perfect. Number 12 was organized faith. There were 12 tribes of Israel. And then you get that symbolic number in Revelation, 144,000. I think the Jehovah's Witnesses use that number and say, that's how many are going to make it to heaven. That doesn't make any sense to me. But for me, 144,000 is a symbolic number that says all believers for all time. It's the 12 times 12 is 144, times the number of completeness, 10, times 10, times 10. 144,000 is every person will have ever believed in Jesus Christ and been a follower of Christ. That's the whole family of God. It's the whole tribe. If you remember the word a white stone, when John says you will receive a white stone, if you received a white stone, that was a symbol of victory. If you had won something, you carried that white stone with you. And the book of Revelation is all about the victory of Christ. The term, the book of life. We hear that all the time, and we say our names are written in the book of life, or we hear that phrase, we don't ever want our names to be stricken from the book of life, right? The book of life existed in virtually every town and city in the first century. When a person was born in that community, the person who was born, their name was written into the book of life. And when that person died, their name was stricken from the book of life. Now, this is my own personal theology. I can't necessarily prove this to you 100%, but it's the way I like to think. And because the scripture says it's the will of God that no one should perish, in my mind, I see every person that's born on this earth is written into the book of life immediately. But every person will have to make a decision whether they're going to accept Christ, be a follower of Christ, believe in God, and be obedient to God, or reject him. And for those who reject him, they're ultimately then stricken from the book of life. God did not send them to hell. He invited them to heaven, and he invited them into a relationship with him, a discipleship-oriented relationship, being an apprentice follower of Jesus Christ. And if people want to reject that, that's their decision. Then they're stricken, not because God sent them to hell, but because they rejected God, and those are the consequences of rejecting God and his Son, Jesus Christ. One of the more mysterious terms or phrases in the book of Revelation is the idea of 3.5 years, or the phrase a time, times, and a half time. They're synonyms. They mean the same thing. 3.5 years, again, this goes back to the idea, the concept that we have of 9/11. 9/11, what happened? Attack on the World Trade Center in New York, plus the other airplanes. 3.5 years to the Jew, that was a time in which Antiochus Epiphanes took over Israel, 167 BC. He overthrew Jerusalem. He came into the temple. He built an altar on top of the altar that was in the temple, and he made a sacrifice from a pig to the god Zeus. Then he took the pig's blood and he spread it all over the temple. And the Jews call that the abomination of desolation. Antiochus Epiphanes ruled over Jerusalem for 3.5 years. So when you hear that phrase, the Jews, first century believers, heard that was an amazing and incredible time of persecution, of suffering. And John is saying to believers in the end times, from crucifixion, resurrection, until Jesus comes again, there will be times of suffering and pain and struggle and persecution, etc., etc. The Bible talks about it as being wars and rumors of wars. There's famine, there's destruction, there's all kinds of things that are happening, and they will happen over a 2,000-year time period. There's a lot more we can say about this 3.5 years in the context of how people understand the book of Revelation, whether those 3.5 years are pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, post-tribulation, etc., etc. All kinds of fun conversations, but we won't have time to go into that tonight. Revelation speaks over and over again about the victory that Christ has won and God's invitation to follow him and to obey him, to be faithful to him, and to persevere. So when we read the book of Revelation, that's the message we will see, it's what we will hear, and it's a message that we also need to apply. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.